wanted us to touch on around? Oh, go ahead.
So the one that I'm still curious on is the science and education class studies.
Oh.
That's I'm going to be looking at one of ours, and you have ranking. What do you mean by that?
I believe it's a type of stated preference method. We don't deal with it a lot, actually.
And that's one of those studies that's not very transferable, so we don't usually use it. Yeah, I think, again, it's a stated preference where people sort of rank different priorities for a science or education curriculum and then attempt to put values on those different priorities. But I'm not that familiar with it, to be honest.
What wasn't it in the reading? It's about as a resource for science to study the world. That's what I thought it meant.
That's what the service sort of is. Also, so people get value from engaging with nature, learning things about nature.
Oh.
So, and scientific research can also, there's resources there. You know, and medicinal resources covers that a little bit, but for example, you could think of like discovering a new drug out in the world from doing research.
Okay, so can I just go through each of those abbreviations and say what I think they represent?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so contingent value, and then what's A?
I think it's amenity, right?
What?
I think it's a typo. I think it's supposed to be avoided cost.
Oh, it's avoided cost? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's just one of them. Yeah.
Replacement cost. P is
Yeah, I don't think we talked about that one. It's actually production values. So some studies kind of value these ecosystem services with models, like biophysical models that kind of calculate what the production of the ecosystem service is.
So that would be like the production of the little fish?
Right, yeah. So it's kind of like a market value like that.
There's some overlap between valuation methods where some of them, market price, they all relate to each other. So there's similarities.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you got most of them. And H is hedonic.
Yeah.
ETC is travel cost.
And I mean, this is just one reference that
Yeah.
these authors use this kind of to get an idea. It's not set in stone. You guys can use other types of valuations for other ecosystem services. Since it's just, don't read too much into it.
Right. It's just maybe a good guide for new benefit transfer practices.
Because our study was on pollination, I don't see it up there. Does that get a high economic valuation? Because
Yeah, or it could also be either cut off, or sometimes they might group it with like biological regulation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
okay. So you said that anything that can be valued through a market is relatively amenable to economic valuation, right? So why are genetic resources ranked as low?
Well, the genetic resources themselves, that usually has to do with how biodiversity supports some of these other ones, or how genetic resources lead to the discovery of medicinal products. So, I mean, you can think that might be really tricky to kind of put a price on.
So while there are things in markets where genetic research has led to a market price, figuring out how a landscape or a land cover leads to that is a murky process.
Right.
Got it.
It has also human inputs in addition to what they actually get from the ecosystem itself. So
Okay.
not all of the value could be attributed to the ecosystem service.
Thank you.
We can upload this table on Canvas so you guys can take a look.
Right. And I actually printed out one of the tables that I gave to all of you. It has the amenability to evaluation and the methods used and how transferred it is.
So
Hopefully
can
that
you
will-
talk a little bit about qualifying the primary valuations and how you determine which ones are best to rely upon?
Yeah, so we have like what we call a double blind review process at Earth Economics, where we'll have two people who are experienced, or relatively, at least one very experienced person, sometimes one newer person who's learning the process, simultaneously go through what we call the transcription process, where they basically take one of these studies in the current state that you see it, and basically try and codify every aspect. And that's what the EVT that I think Nora talked about, or showed you guys, was. So she talked about it. So basically, it has a series of containers or fields. So there's bibliographic information, that's pretty obvious. Then you get to the site information, which is, okay, where did this take place? We even put in GIS coordinates, describe the biophysical features of that location. So that you're getting from the paper. Sometimes you might need to do external research if they don't provide all of the information about the site. Then the question is, okay, what ecosystem service are they looking at? And sometimes there's a sub-service, so there's the 21 ecosystem services, but maybe it's like food, but specifically production of watermelons. So that's the next step. After ecosystem service, there's the valuation methodology. So going in and looking at the methodology, describing how they did it, and codifying that. And after that, you're actually then trying to extract the values and put them into a database in a replicable way. So that process can be very tricky because the authors don't always make it easy for you to get all that information out of their study. So that's why we have two people do it, and it's checked. Determining whether it's a good study or not is a little bit, I don't know, it's tricky. It's some studies have just been known, maybe they're too old. Maybe when you read it and you try and do this codification process, you realize that their methods or their data wasn't very good. They didn't have a good sample size. Their model didn't really make sense. They did some weird stuff when they tried to convert to dollar values.
They have poor references to their data, so you can't really
You don't
find
know
and
where
replicate it.
yeah, you don't know where they
it
got
came
their
from.
data. So all those things go into it. There's no equation for determining whether we're going to use their study or not. Within our database, we have sort of a study is entered, and then it's in draft form. Then it goes to pending when one person has gone through it fully and thinks it's good. Then it can be there's a couple more stages after that until it gets finalized. And even then, once you're to the finalized studies, when you're doing a benefit transfer, you still review every study that you're considering adding in. So there's a pretty thorough process we go through to determine whether a study ends up in a benefit transfer. That's kind of how the process works. So we say, it's a lot faster to do a secondary evaluation. Well, relatively, it still takes a while and quite a bit of work every time we do it. Hopefully, as this EVT gets better, the data gets cleaner, and we have more and more studies in it, it'll get faster, and we'll be able to do more of these studies and even open up some of that information for other people to use and do their own secondary evaluation studies. Cool. Okay, so we just have a couple minutes. Do you want me to go run through it? Okay. So we recently did this RCO study, which I think you guys may have read. So it's the recreation of Washington State. I was involved with gathering a lot of that data and doing the analysis, so I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about what I did and see if you guys had any questions. So what we were contracted to do with the Recreation Conservation Office was an economic impact analysis. You might be familiar with these types of studies from news reports. This was just from a few weeks ago. And there was an article, I just searched economic impact analysis. NFL Stadium in Carson would generate more than 10,000 jobs and $500 million in annual revenue. So that is the similar type of methodology that we use in the RCO study. So it's just good to know how these studies work because you hear about them a lot. They're used to argue for certain policies in local, state, and federal governments. And these studies aren't always done well. We tried to do the best job we could, and I learned a lot about how the process worked through that. But again, you want to be a little wary when you see these kinds of studies because they can be a little bit strange sometimes. So this is just sort of the summary of from our study. We basically looked at Washington outdoor recreation. We looked at how much time people spend recreating, both Washingtonians and visitors. How many days a year they were spending outside, and then how much they would actually spend while recreating and doing associated activities to recreation. The idea behind this was we were trying to determine what is the economic contribution and impact, and those are two sort of different terms that get thrown around. I can talk a little bit about the difference, but seeing what those were and sort of comparing that to other economic figures of a lot. So like, where does recreation fit in with the rest of our economy? How important is it? So you probably, I didn't know you guys looked at this before I made this study, but this was a good graph that kind of shows the methodology we went through. We sort of looked at all the recreational land types and all the different types of participants. So you have a population engaging in recreation on local parks, going to state parks, going to U.S. Forest Service lands, going to national parks, going to ski resorts. So those are all the land types. Okay, and going to those places, you have all different types of people. People who are coming locally just for the day, people who are spending the night, people who are coming from out of town to spend the night. Now, if I go to the Olympic Peninsula for the day and go hiking, you know, I'm spending some money on gas, maybe I'll pick up some food. It's a lot different than someone flies into Seattle, they rent a car, they drive out there, they get a hotel room for the night. You know, they buy a recreation pass for the weekend. So there's a much different expenditure profile between those two things. So we had to take that into account. So what we did is we used outside data sources to figure out roughly how many of these types of participants there were for each recreational land type for every activity. So again, if I'm going hiking, I'm spending a lot different money than if I go skiing or if I'm going boating. So for all the different activities on these different land cover types, we had different profiles based on mostly survey data for different activities. So we had, for each type of visitor, a specific profile, and that gave us a general idea of how much money would be spent at each of these land types over the course of a year. So that allowed us to do an economic benefit, economic contribution, and impact analysis. So getting into the weeds about what those things are isn't as important, I think, as understanding sort of the process we went through to get there. So we were able to do that analysis at different spatial scales, mainly at the county level, but also at the state level. So that's how we got those total results. And we got these interesting results of that people were spending. So when you took up all those different visitor types and how much they would spend on a day of recreation and summed it all up, that people were spending almost $21.6 billion a year on recreation. But that's not just like equipment and passes. That includes if you're going to a hotel when you're recreating. That includes if you're spending money on food at a restaurant or a grocery store. That also includes gasoline, any equipment. So boat repairs, boat rentals, ski gear. So that's why you can see that number getting big pretty quickly. Now we had all of that information about spending. That went into this software tool called Implan. And Implan is it's a software suite that they provide you with the software and then you buy data. So they basically have economic models for every county in the whole United States that kind of tell you if you spend $1 on a certain commodity or a certain industry, how does that dollar then travel through the rest of the economy? So if I go spend, $50 at a restaurant, well, that restaurant buys supplies, maybe some from local suppliers, maybe some from out-of-state suppliers. That restaurant's also paying their employees a wage, and those employees are then going and spending their money locally on their own stuff. So Implan is a way to track all of that through the economy, and that's what we use to come up with these numbers. So that kind of leads me to the direct, indirect, and induced. So you guys, again, probably read this, but just to go over it again. The direct is how much people are spending when they go. Okay, I'm going to a restaurant, I'm going to buy gas, I'm buying a pass to do recreation. That's the direct. The indirect is when I go and I spend money at a restaurant, well, what are the suppliers of that restaurant? So that's what the indirect contribution comes from. Buying as the money travels up the supply chain, basically. The induced economic contribution is from wages. So when I go spend money at a restaurant, I'm sticking with this example, but it applies to all of the categories. Where do those employees then spend their money, and how does that travel through the economy? So Implan's really great because it creates this whole model, and it basically uses these multipliers for every different industry. When you spend $1 here, what factor of that goes out to each other industry?